proposed a while ago by Simon Kuznets, a famous economist, and it's referred to as the inverted U hypothesis. So there you see a picture of the inverted U. Inequality first goes up, levels off, and then comes down. And there are various explanations given why this might happen. For example, initially, growth usually starts in a few sectors and a few regions, and it's only benefiting a small portion of the population. But if growth and development continues, and if it can spread more broadly, if there are linkages to other sectors and regions, then that growth can spread and benefit more people more widely. And if that happens, inequality will decline. Also, in a country like China that people think has been characterized by labor surplus, with growth and development, employment expands, and eventually, maybe sooner, maybe later, there's debate about that, eventually, if the labor surplus is exhausted, wages will begin to rise, and that tends to benefit people who are lower income, who rely on wages, and that can also help promote redistribution and a decline in inequality. So we can ask, do we see this sort of pattern in China? So today what I'd like to talk about is what's happened both up to 2002 with respect to inequality and poverty in China, what's happened up to 2002 when who and when assumed leadership, and what's happened since. There's been a lot written about inequality and poverty in China. Here I just mentioned a few of the many studies. These are by economists, but there's also been a lot of work by sociologists and others. Most of that work, however, goes up to 2002 or the early 2000s, simply because we haven't had more recent household level data with which to measure poverty and inequality. I'd like to present some new findings for more recent times through 2007, which covers a big chunk, although certainly not all of the Hu-Wen era. It stops before the recent world economic crisis, but nevertheless it gives us a pretty good picture of what was happening through a big portion of the Hu-Wen era. This is joint work with others, Li Shi and Luo Chuliang at Beijing Normal University, and Yue Ximing at Renmin University of China. And it's under the umbrella of the CHIP project, the China Household Income Project. Here's a little information about the CHIP project. I don't know how interested you are in the details, but essentially this is an ongoing collaborative research, international collaborative research project that was started in the late 80s, involving Chinese and non-Chinese researchers to collect on a large scale household survey data, nationwide data for China, so that we can track trends in inequality and incomes. If properly weighted, the data are representative for the country as a whole and for regions. It includes collecting data using an independent survey instrument, which means we can ask more questions and ask questions particular to measurement of income. In our study of inequality, we're measuring inequality in income. Inequality can occur in lots of things, education, health, and so forth, as well as income. But here I'm just focusing on income. And the measure of income is disposable income, including wage earnings, pension income, net income from farming and self-employment, businesses, income from assets, including housing. I'll say a word about that in a minute. Transfers and subsidies, but net of taxes. Some of our findings are a little different than other studies because the CHIPS measure the CHIP project measures income a little differently, and I think probably the most important difference is that the CHIP study includes, as part of income, imputed rents on owner-occupied housing. So this is sort of a technical point, but I think a significant point. Most international studies of income have concluded that a part of income is the return on owner-occupied housing. And the idea here is that people have a certain amount of savings, and they can invest it in different ways. If they invested it in, put it in the bank, put it in some sort of savings vehicle, they would earn income on it, and that income would be counted as part of their total income. But if they invested in housing, it isn't, you don't have it's such an easily measurable return on those savings. Nevertheless, for consistency, the return on those savings should be counted, regardless of whether they're invested in a bank account or in a house, they should be counted as part of income. So because we have this independent survey, we can collect information on the value of housing and estimated rents, and that allows us to, in a way consistent with other studies, impute the returns on housing. Imputed rents is what this is called. Another difference between the CHIP studies and some other studies is that there are data in recent years for migrants, rural urban migrants, and so they can be included in the analysis. Our measure of inequality is called the Gini coefficient, which is a commonly used measure. It ranges from 0 to 1. And I guess the main point is that 0 means perfect equality, that if you have a society where income is equally distributed, everyone has exactly the same amount of income, the Gini coefficient would be 0. Obviously, there aren't any countries or societies like that, so typically the lowest Gini coefficients found for nations are in the range of 0.2 or 0.3. If there were perfect inequality, which would be if one person had all the income and everybody else had 0, not a very sustainable situation, then the Gini coefficient would be 1. And again, obviously, there are not many countries, or there aren't any countries that have perfect inequality. So the high end of the range of Gini coefficients measured for countries tends to be around 0.5 to 0.6. So when you see these Gini coefficients numbers that I'm putting up, some of you know what they are, but some of you may not be familiar with the measure. Basically, the idea is the farther away it is from 0 and the closer it is to 1, the more inequality there is. Oops. So first, let's look at trends in inequality up to 2002. And here, this is a period that's been widely studied. I'm just showing here the results based on the CHIP project. So in the late 80s, inequality in China was, the Gini coefficient was about 0.4. It rose substantially through up to 1995, reached about 0.47, and then leveled off. So there appears to be some moderation of the rise in inequality in the late 90s through 2002. Some of the factors underlying increasing inequality prior to 2002 in the literature are the widening urban-rural income gap. Within rural areas, inequality increased because of the development of off-farm wage employment in township and village enterprises, which initially benefited a smaller segment of the population. Access to these jobs was rationed and not universal, and these were higher paying jobs than agriculture. So that created an upward force on rural inequality. There were widening income gaps between provinces and regions, and especially after the mid-90s, the returns to education began to increase. so that the difference in income between people with more education and less education began to widen. But in the late 90s through 2000, moderating forces, there were some regional and provincial catch-up. For example, provinces like Shandong, which had lagged behind earlier on, began to catch up. Rural off-farm employment became quite widespread by the end of the 1990s, early 2000s. So initially it had been inequality generating off-farm wage employment, but as it spread, it actually began to be equality, promote equality. And so provincial catch-up and the spread of off-farm jobs is consistent with what we might expect if the Kuznets hypothesis held. Like growth is spreading beyond the initial small sectors, and as it spreads to new regions, and as job access spreads within rural areas, inequality will be moderated, could be moderated. And finally, growth throughout has been shared quite widely, and this helps dampen inequality. What's happened since 2002? Yes?
What are you doing about household? You're presenting individual income inequality,
Right.
What are you doing about the household scales and sharing the rent among members?
We're just taking in this we've just taken the simplest approach, which is assuming inequality within households, that there's equal division of income within households. There are studies that use equivalent scales, and some studies of intra-household inequality. I don't think they change the big picture. So here you see I've added 2007 to the picture, and you can see that inequality was not leveling off, that it continued or resumed its rise, reaching almost 0.5. The Gini coefficient reached almost 0.5 in 2007. So China, at least as of 2007, was not yet at the Kuznets turning point. And inequality in China has been increasingly high relative to other countries, inequality in other countries. So here are some country comparisons. You can see countries that tend to have lower inequality at the range of 0.2, 0.25 are countries like Sweden, Austria, and the Netherlands. Obviously, they're smaller countries, so maybe it's not entirely surprising. The US, well, Canada there is in about the middle, with inequality about 0.35. And India a little bit higher. The US close to 0.4, but not there yet, at least by the UNU wider estimates. And China's it's still not among the highest. Colombia and Brazil have Gini coefficients well in excess of 0.5, but it's getting there. Where did inequality increase after 2007? Well, we've only done preliminary analyses of what's underlying inequality, but I'll tell you what we know so far. Rural areas showed very little change in inequality. So it didn't come from changes within rural areas. Within urban areas, there was some modest, not much, but slight increases in inequality. But there was a big increase in the difference in incomes between rural and urban areas. And this is just continuing a trend that has been noted already. The rural-urban income gap in 2002 was about 3.3. That means on average, incomes in urban areas were more than 3 times average incomes in rural areas. In 2007, they were more than 4 times. Urban incomes were more than 4 times incomes in rural areas. And these are high urban-rural income gaps by international standards. The contribution to national inequality of the urban-rural income gap, again, is a very rough calculation, but the estimates show it rising from about 40% of overall inequality to more than half of overall inequality being associated with the difference in urban and rural incomes. Another result, again, this is a preliminary result from our analysis, which I think is noteworthy and I'd like to mention today, is that income from assets and property have become more important to incomes and to inequality of incomes. And this maybe isn't that surprising, because China has implemented a wide range of reforms that have created property ownership, private property ownership, including urban housing privatization, the development of real estate markets, and accompanied by rising housing prices, at least in urban China, as well as enterprise reforms, some types of privatization of enterprises, and the expansion of financial markets, stock markets. So with these reforms, income from assets and properties become more important, and it's begun to affect both the urban-rural income gap and overall inequality. So here I've measured the urban-rural income gap, excluding income from property and assets, and including it. Here we're defining this income very narrowly, just to include income from financial assets and the imputed income from owned housing, owner-occupied housing. So if you exclude that income, the urban-rural income gap increased about 12% between 2002 and 2007. If you include it, the urban-rural income gap increased almost 25%. As a share of income, asset and property income, narrowly measured in this way, was about 10% of income in 2002, and by 2007, it had increased a bit in rural areas to 13% of income on average. But in urban areas, it had increased to nearly a fifth of a household per capita income. And nationwide, it had risen from about 10% to 15% of household per capita income. Its contribution to overall inequality, again, you see the impact is biggest for urban areas and for the country as a whole. In urban areas, the contribution of this type of income to inequality rose from about 10% to about 20%, and nationwide, again, from about 10% to 17 or 18%. So that's the story for inequality. I'd like to now look at poverty, which I think is important because part of the focus of policies under WHO and when has been not just to try to address growing inequality, but also to target and assistance to the most vulnerable, the poor. So I have some estimates of poverty, which are measured using a poverty line, the international poverty line of $1.25 a day, which is used by the World Bank and other international organizations. There are lots of different studies of poverty in China that use different poverty lines, and they show different levels of poverty, but they all show similar trends over time. So when we look at the numbers, I would like to focus on changes or trends over time. So the numbers are based on counting the number of people whose income is below $1.25 a day and looking at the share of the population that falls below that threshold. So first looking at what happened prior to 2002, these are estimates from Chun and Ravalian. the poverty rate and the total number of poor declined markedly. In the early 90s, poverty was over 40% of the population was below this poverty line. By 2002, 15% of the population was below the poverty line. And the number of poor dropped from nearly 500 million to less than 200 million. So that's a lot of people are no longer below the poverty line, at least by this kind of analysis. What's happened since 2002 up through 2007? The decline has continued. Here the green bars or green columns are poverty rates in 2002, and the blue columns are poverty rates in 2007. These estimates are based on the CHIP data, so the levels are a little different, but again, I'm focusing on the trends, and the trend is that nationwide poverty declined markedly in this period, from 10% to about 4%, so declined by more than half. And especially in rural areas, poverty declined by more than half, from 15% to about 6%. In urban areas, poverty was already low, but even in urban areas, poverty reduction occurred. So we see continued substantial declines in poverty since 2002, or at least up through 2007. And the remaining poor, there are roughly 50 million remaining poor, which is still a big number in absolute terms, bigger than the population of my country of residence, Canada. They're overwhelmingly rural, regionally dispersed, although the poverty rate is highest in Western China. And a higher proportion, increasingly high proportion of the remaining poor face chronic difficulties, so it's increasingly hard to find ways to alleviate poverty for those who remain poor. By international standards, China has changed from a high poverty country to a moderately low poverty country. And China's poverty reduction record is very good, if not outstanding, by international standards. So here are poverty rates in some selected countries at the $1.25 a day poverty line, using that as a threshold for poverty. Very few developed countries show up because they all have, at this poverty line, this is a very low poverty line, and they have very little, trivial amounts of poverty at this level, but you can see countries like Turkey, Argentina, Armenia, the Dominican Republic have poverty below 5% at the $1.25 a day cutoff, and China now is well below 10%, so it's sort of in that group. But in the early 90s, well, actually in the early 2000s, it was up in the next group between 10 and 20% with Honduras and Vietnam and the Philippines. And in the early 90s, it was further to the right with countries like Indonesia, Ghana, and even earlier India, Mali, and the Congo. Mali and the Congo. Yes? Well, if you think about they aren't necessarily conflicting results, because you can have, the question is, I guess, you have a distribution, right? And if the mean is lower, more people in the bottom tail will be below the poverty line. If the mean rises, that can pull everyone up above the poverty line, but you can still have the same amount of inequality, right? It's just that everybody has the whole distribution is shifted up. Does that make sense? Yeah. China's share of the world poor has declined over time, and especially, I mean, it's continued to decline since 2002. These are just numbers through 2005. The latest numbers for which I have this, which is from the World Bank estimates. But you can see that in 2002, China had over 20% of the world's poor. In 2005, it had 15% of the world's poor, which suggests that poverty reduction in China is occurring more rapidly than elsewhere in the world on average. So let me try to draw some conclusions from all these numbers and graphs that I've shown you. Despite official announcements and a wide range of new policies, income inequality has continued to increase in China, at least through 2007. And to some extent, this is the continuation of past trends associated with, among other things, the widening urban-rural income gap. And to some extent, it's reflecting some new factors, the increasing role of asset and property inequality. Asset and property inequality is potentially a hot-button issue. I know, I see from your speaker series you had someone speak about attitudes about inequality in China. Pierre Landry, following up on work by Marty White. And I don't know what Pierre Landry's conclusions were, but
that inequality is not a big problem because
people
people aren't very upset about it.
still aren't upset about it.
According to them, yeah.
According to them, okay. Well, I can't speak for whether or not people are upset about inequality in China or not. I have to rely on other people's findings, but it strikes me that inequality of income from assets and property could potentially be a hot button issue because the way people have gained their wealth and property is not always transparent and fair. So the housing reform was not equitable or transparent, urban housing reform. There's ongoing rent sinking in real estate and enterprises. And real estate and financial markets continue to be quite imperfect, and there's not equal access to them. There's been major progress in poverty reduction, and some studies suggest that to some extent this is it can be attributed to some of the new policies, but to some extent it's just ongoing growth benefiting the poor as well as the rich. So that's all for the good. But although poverty in an absolute sense, measured according to an absolute threshold, has declined, relative to the rest of the population, we have to remember that the poor may be falling further behind. And the CHIP data, in fact, indicate that this is the case. So if you were to look at the income of the richest 10% of the population in China relative to the poorest 10%, in 2002, the average income of the richest 10% was 19 times that of the poorest 10%. In 2007, it was 25 times that of the poorest 10%. It was already big in 2002, the gap, and it's gotten bigger. It got bigger between 2002 and 2007. Also, some people measure poverty in a different way than using a sort of fixed poverty line. They measure it in relative terms. For example, I don't know how, I think in the US it's still an absolute poverty measure, right? But in Canada and some other countries, poverty is measured in relative terms, relative to median income. Commonly, the cutoff is 50% of median income, sometimes a little higher, 60% of median income. If we do a poverty line, a relative poverty line for China of 50% of median income, then poverty in 2002 was 12%. In 2007, it was 15%. So relative poverty in China seems to be continuing to grow. And as the number of absolute poor shrinks and becomes, those absolute poor become relatively few, typically societies begin to pay more attention to relative poverty. That becomes a greater concern. So I'll conclude by saying that challenges to a harmonious society in China remain, and that the nature of those challenges is evolving, and so in the future, policies will need to adapt to take into account new aspects of poverty and inequality. Thank you.